Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I want to show you how to draw rocks. Rocks are an important part of landscapes. It's an important detail when drawing landscapes, and I guess I do a lot of those. So I wanted to make this demonstration, but when a beginner looks at something like this, it can look a little bit daunting, it can look a little bit complicated, but it shouldn't be. Because the thing is that if you can draw simple shapes, then you can draw rocks. So let's start with a slightly simpler demonstration, and then I'm going to show you how I did this detailed drawing of rocks. I'm going to grab a smaller piece of paper and I'm going to draw a few simple shapes, like for example a circle or a ball in this case, because we're trying to draw three-dimensional objects. Because if you can draw a ball, you can draw a rock, and if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. But that's neither here nor there. So let's draw a ball. I'm using a piece of vine charcoal, by the way. And you have to have a light source, obviously. The light usually comes from above, but it usually comes more from one side or the other. So let's say that in this case it comes from here. So this side of our ball is going to be a little bit darker. I can smudge that around a little bit with the tortillon. Now, if you want to make that even more complex, then because there's usually a little bit of reflected light from below, this is going to be the darkest area here, and this area will be just a little bit lighter. Alright, and there's usually, let me just clean up the edge a little bit. And there's usually going to be a little bit of shadow here under that ball. Didn't make a great looking shadow, but I think you get the point. So now we have a three-dimensional object. If you can draw that, then you should be able to draw rocks. Now, rocks usually have these rough, jagged, angular shapes. Some of them are smooth and round, but some of them are kind of angular. So if you can draw something like a cube, you should be able to draw rocks as well. So let's go with the same light source coming from here. This is going to be the lightest surface, the lightest part of the object. This one is going to be this face is going to be a little bit darker, and this one is probably going to be the darkest, I guess, and there's going to be a little bit of a shadow again. I can just blend that a little bit with the tortillon. Now, these are some very simple shapes, obviously, but there are ways to make them a little bit more complicated, because rocks are more complicated, especially the image that I just showed you. So how can we make this a little bit more complex? So let's say that we have a shape like this, and that we have another shape here that's kind of sticking out like a small cube here. Alright, so how are we going to deal with that? So we're staying with the same light source, so this area here is going to be the darkest, and because this is the light side, I can actually use a pencil eraser for this. Because this is the light side, this little part here that's sticking out is going to be is also going to be a little bit lighter. So you can see now how now we have a slightly more complex shape. We have something like a cube, but it's irregular. Now there's a small protrusion here, and you can do the same thing with various kind of geometrical objects, whether they are more curved or more angular like this one. Now let's move on to this slightly more complex demonstration, and I hope that you'll find it useful. I'm going to go over the tools real quick. Charcoal pencils, vine charcoal for erasing, a kneaded eraser, an eraser and a pencil, various brushes, tortillons. Let's get to it. I'm going to start with a piece of vine charcoal. And I'm going to start by creating some suggestions of these rough angular shapes. I don't have to commit to anything. I can just draw some shapes that kind of look like rocks. Vine charcoal is easy to modify, and easy to erase, or at least easier than compressed charcoal from charcoal pencils. I'm going to use a medium charcoal pencil to draw to go over some of these lines where there would be a little bit more value. My light source this time is going to be coming from the right. So I'm going to do the opposite thing. The light source is going to be coming from the right and from above. So the left side is going to be darker, but not the entire left side, but the left side of each of these segments, because this mass of rocks is going to consist of many smaller rocks. And another reason why I used a charcoal pencil for some of these lines is because I didn't want to lose them once I go over this with vine charcoal. Because once I go over it with the vine charcoal and once I start blending, some of the lines from my sketch would be lost, and I didn't want to lose all of them. I wanted some of them to remain so that I could still retain that idea, that original shape that I had in mind. So what we're drawing here is kind of like a complex rock that consists of smaller rocks and stones, and it's kind of like a rocky mound or a rocky hill. That's what I'm going for. Now I'm going to start blending with a brush and spreading that vine charcoal, because I need to establish some base value. Base value means the overall tone, the basic tone of my rock, and within that tone we'll have some variation or range of value, where there will be some shadow areas of darker value and some lighter areas of lighter value, and There will also be some cracks in between those rocks, which will be of very, very dark value. I showed you my tools. I'm going to say a few more words about them and the paper as well. These are Warrison woodless charcoal pencils. I don't really know the brand of the vine charcoal I'm using. I don't think it's that important. And you can use any pencil or any type of vine charcoal. The ones that I'm using here are short. I need a longer one, so this one, I think this one will do, because when shading I need a slightly longer. These are Statovac, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's the brand, but like I said, it doesn't really matter. I never pay attention to these things. Anyway, now that I've established the base tone, I'm starting to shade over that with some vine charcoal, and now I'm putting in some shadow areas or areas of darker value. Here in this stage I'm breaking up this shape into smaller shapes. I'm kind of defining its topography, the shape of its surface. And the surface is rough with a lot of these faces that are receiving light from above under different angles. Some of them are facing away from the light source, and those are darker, and some of them are facing towards the light source, which is on the right, like I said, and those are going to be lighter. Some of those shapes will be more jagged and more angular and more rough. There will be cleaner transitions, clear edges to value. Others will be softer, slightly rounder, and there will be softer transitions with edges that aren't as clear. So we're going to have all of that in this rock. It doesn't look like much at this point, but as I keep shading, it's going to start to take shape. I've already defined some of the shadow areas, and now that I'm blending that with a brush, I'm gently spreading that vine charcoal. You can see how that upper part of the rock, that top of that rocky mound, is starting to take shape. Now we can feel like that side of the rock is facing away from the light source, and the top is lighter because it's facing upwards. And on the left there is another smaller rock which is slightly darker, and here in the middle there are also some shapes which are a little bit deeper into the rock, cut deeper into the rock, and they're getting less light. You'll notice that I'm doing a lot of cleaning up with Kneaded Eraser every now and then. That's because I want to keep the outer edges of the object clean, and that's very important because I want it to stand out against the background as a separate object. Kneaded erasers are good for cleaning up, but they're also good for drawing and taking away value and drawing lighter shapes. As erasers, I mostly use a Faber-Castell Kneaded Eraser and a Kohinoor eraser in a pencil. Here, for drawing the lighter sides of these rocks, I'm going to be using a combination of both. Now I'm going in over some of these shaded areas, over these darker areas, and I'm adding a little bit more value and texture at the same time using a medium charcoal pencil. I normally use two grades of charcoal pencils, a medium one and the soft one, and here I'm using a medium one to add some more detail within those shadow areas, to add some more detail and texture, as well as amount of value within those shadow areas. Now when you're drawing a larger complex shape, what you can do is first you can establish the larger relationships between areas of lighter and darker value. So I started by doing that, but then as you can see, I was kind of impatient and I started defining some of these smaller shapes. You don't have to do it that way. You can kind of define the larger rocks, the larger shapes first, and then move in with the details. Or you can do what I just did. You can do a little bit of both. You can first define some of the larger shapes, and then you can move on with some of the details, and then you can go back to drawing the larger shapes and defining the larger relationships between larger areas of lighter and darker value. Now I'm going to do a combination of both. I'm going to be shading a little bit with the vine charcoal and a little bit with charcoal pencils, and as you can see, I'm doing a bit of refining with a Tortillion. A Tortillion is also a good drawing tool as well as a blending tool. When it picks up some charcoal, you can use it to draw some shapes, but I can also use it to blend a little bit, to push the charcoal into smaller areas where the brush maybe wouldn't be quite as precise, and do things like that. So let's start taking away a bit of value from some of these lighter areas. I can just dab some of these areas, lighter areas. I can dab them a little bit with the kneaded eraser, and you can see how easily the kneaded eraser is lifting up the vine charcoal that I laid down, and it's increasing that range of value. And by increasing the range of value, we're making our objects more three-dimensional, and we're giving them more depth, more volume, and creating that illusion that the viewer is really looking at something that has shape and volume. Here, for example, I'm using this pencil eraser now, by the way. You can also pick off some of these smaller shapes within the shadow areas and maybe make them look like these are some, how should I put this, smaller pieces of rock which are kind of sticking out and are getting more light from above because they're jutting out. So you can do that. You can go over these lighter areas, make them even lighter. You can play around with your stroke, do a little bit of cross-hatching, maybe a little bit of scribbling with that pencil eraser. Use it like you would a pencil, creating some lighter texture maybe. So you can do all kinds of things. And another important thing that you can do, you can clean up some of the edges, because in some of these places you want really rough, clean edges, and you want these clean, sudden transitions between areas of lighter and darker value, so that the viewer can feel like, this is a crack, this is an area where this rock, where one part of that rock ends and the other one begins. So you can do things like that, and I think these clean edges with sharp contrasts really contribute a lot to realism when you're drawing rocks. And now I'm going to do a bit more shading with a piece of vine charcoal, and I'm going to shade some larger areas now. There's another large piece of rock here in the middle, and I'm going to start by maybe shading some of its parts, maybe trying to separate it into segments. One of the good things about working with charcoal, especially with vine charcoal, which is so easy to manipulate, is that when you work there are a lot of these happy accidents. When you start blending and moving around fine charcoal. In a way, it's similar to some other types of media, like for example watercolor, where there are a lot of these happy accidents, and you can just go with the flow and take the advantage, take the opportunity that are presented to you. You know, some shapes will just start to appear to you, even though you didn't necessarily have them in mind when you started out drawing. So you just scribble a little bit like I'm doing now. I do have a general idea in mind, and I am studying a couple of reference photos while I'm doing this, but the end result is going to be something completely different, and it's probably best to do it that way because it allows for more spontaneity, and it's actually a lot more fun to draw that way. So now you can see how quickly I managed to define some of the larger areas, and here I'm just putting down some smaller rocks at the bottom around that larger piece of rock. I'm going to try to blend a little bit with a brush now. And you will notice that I'm using two different types of brushes. I have one that is slightly softer and one that is a little bit harder, stiffer bristle brush. The stiffer brush, the harder brush, tends to push the charcoal a little bit more into the grain of the paper, while at the same time preserving the texture. The softer one moves the charcoal on the surface of the paper and allows me to create softer transitions. So I like to use those in a combination with other blending tools such as tortillons, as well as sometimes even my finger. I like to combine different types of blending tools. I like to take advantage of all of the good things about different blending tools, their advantages, and I don't like to limit myself to just one blending tool, because they all do have slightly different effects. So I did a bit of shading here at the bottom, and now you can see that we have a nice looking shape. We have a lot of nice looking rocks, and I'm gonna use this medium charcoal pencil again to start going over these areas which I covered with the vine charcoal, and I'm going to go over those to create areas of even darker value and maybe some details and textures. So I'm basically creating some random details, random textures. Again, we're talking about happy accidents, as Bob Ross would call them. Just allowing the pencil to work for me, allowing the pencil to create a texture and to create some suggestions of details, maybe some irregularities in the face of the rock, suggestions of cracks, smaller stones and pebbles and things like that. And that will really add a lot to the illusion of realism that I'm trying to create. I'm also, as I'm shading this, like I said, I'm breaking this larger shape into smaller shapes, into smaller rocks. And as you can see, I'm trying to stay consistent with the light source so that those surfaces which are facing away from the light source are a bit darker. But sometimes you need to make things a little bit unpredictable, and sometimes a lighter area will appear and you'll just leave it like that because you want to make it look like a jutting rock that's getting more light from above. And I'm also going to add more light here at the bottom of the rock, because that's where there would be more shadow. And I'm also going to create some suggestions of smaller rocks or stones around this larger rock to make the ground around it more interesting. As before, I'm using that pencil eraser to create cleaner edges, but at the same time take away a bit of value and clean up some of the edges and create some suggestions of smaller shapes. Like, for example, here I can just erase a little bit of that darker value and maybe create a suggestion of another shape which is sticking out and receiving more light from above. Basically making the overall shape more interesting and more complex. It doesn't really take much to do that, just a few suggestions of lighter and darker value here and there, and the whole shape starts to become more interesting and more complex. I'm blending with this hard bristle brush, and notice that even though I am pushing the charcoal into the paper and I'm not very gentle with my paper, I'm actually preserving the texture. That's one of the advantages of brushes. They don't kill the texture, and texture is very important here. Tortillions, on the other hand, they tend to blend more thoroughly, and when you blend with a tortillion or a blending stump, they tend to destroy a lot of that texture. So one of the advantages of brushes is that they allow you to preserve some of that texture while kind of softening those lines just a little bit. But I do like to use tortillions as well, and I like to use a combination of blending tools, as I've already explained. The paper I'm using is a 200 GSM Fabriano paper. I don't really know exactly which one, but I do remember that it was a Fabriano paper. The size of the paper is 10 times 14 inches, so it's a slightly larger piece of paper because I plan to use this sketch for another project. But for now I'm just going to draw these rocks. And now I'm doing something very important. I'm moving in with a soft charcoal pencil, and this is the darkest thing that I have. This soft charcoal pencil is producing these very, very dark areas which I'm putting in between the rocks. Notice how they are increasing the depth of the image, and how they are making everything look even more three-dimensional, and how these cracks or spaces in between the rock, these shadow areas in between the rocks, are starting to look deeper and darker. So I'm basically increasing the range of value, and I'm increasing a feeling of depth and volume. I don't like to overdo it with a soft charcoal pencil. I like to use it sparingly, because if I use too much of that dark value, it would be overpowering, and I would end up with something that looks both dark and flat at the same time. But this way, when I use it sparingly, and when I have a nice range of value from the lightest areas, which I also like to put in sparingly, and the darker areas, which, like I said, there are a limited number of them, then you create these nice looking stones and rocks that look pretty three-dimensional. I've already done most of the work, and now I'm just going to do a little bit of refining using that pencil eraser that I talked about earlier. This is in a regular eraser in a pencil by Kohinoor. it can be sharpened, and this smaller tip allows you a bit more control when you're drawing, because you can use it as you would a pencil. You can use a kneaded eraser in a similar way, but I do think that they have slightly different effects, and sometimes one is more convenient than the other, so I like to use both. This paper that I'm using, this Fabriano paper, is very thick and can take a lot of abuse from my blending tools, but it's also a bit more rough. It has a bit more texture and tooth than the paper I'm normally using, which is a good thing here because I'm trying to produce some rough texture, and I'm not too worried about smaller details. This thing will look very realistic even without those. So right now I'm just trying to go over some of these lighter areas and push that contrast a little bit more, and create an even bigger range of value, so that everything will look more three-dimensional. And once again, you can see how I'm picking out some of these smaller bits, creating some suggestions of lighter bits here and there, so that the viewer can feel like these rocks are a really irregular shape, and maybe some of these smaller, lighter shapes are actually pieces of rock which are sticking out from that shadow, getting more light. Being more exposed to the light. Here at the bottom I can also draw some suggestions of grass, maybe a few blades of grass here and there. Here I can clean up some of these edges to make these rocks a little more, a little cleaner, a little more angular looking. And basically putting down some finishing touches and refining these shapes. I mean, you can stop at any point, or you can just play around with it, make it even more complex. And another thing that you can also do is you can hold your pencil sideways and just drag it across some of these darker areas, and even maybe some of these lighter areas, adding a little bit of random texture. That's one of the things that I like to do when I work with charcoal. I just drag the charcoal pencil across the paper a little bit, and then I add some random texture, which creates a great illusion of detail. And when people look at that drawing, they really feel like I put in a lot of work into drawing every single detail and every single crack, when in fact I didn't really do that much work. This whole thing took less than an hour to draw, probably around 40 minutes. I tried to play most of it in real time for you, but some parts of it are in time-lapse. If you want to see longer videos, like full-length narrated videos, you can check out my Patreon. There's lots of content there, and I post videos every month. And if you want to see other landscape videos, make sure you check out other videos on my channel, because I have lots of drawings of landscapes, and as well as other stuff. I'm just drawing some suggestions of grass and some smaller rocks here on this terrain, next to the rock, or next to those rocks. But I think this should do it for now. These are just some of the finishing touches where I'm going over some of these areas with a brush a little bit. So the drawing is now done. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process, and I hope that some of you will find it useful. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.